This week on Inside Olympia, how is and will artificial intelligence change life as we know it? Will it be a net positive or a net negative? How will it affect the future of work? And what are the implications for government and public policymakers? On the program, Arthur Jago from the University of Washington Tacoma and Rob Lloyd of the Center for Digital Government.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Artificial intelligence has been described as the most disruptive technological development since the Industrial Revolution, and even more transformative than the dawn of the current computer and internet age. It's even caught the attention of Pope Leo, who this past weekend released a 42,000-word open letter on the topic, warning that AI must be disarmed. Proponents and evangelists for AI say it holds great promise to improve medicine and science, help workers become more efficient, and so much more. The president warns we are in a race with China for AI supremacy. Whatever your point of view, the rapid evolution and mainstreaming of AI has implications for the public sector, the private sector, for jobs, and for almost every aspect of modern life. So how should we be approaching AI? What should policymakers do? And what opportunities and risks do governments face when deciding if and how to deploy AI? This hour, we dive deep into the role of AI in modern society with two Washington State experts. Arthur Jago is an associate professor in the Milgard School of Business at the University of Washington Tacoma, where his research examines algorithms, human judgment, and the social psychology of technology. Rob Lloyd is the City of Seattle's former chief technology officer who now leads the Center for Digital Government and the Center for Public Sector AI, which advises state and local governments on topics including emerging AI governance. Welcome, both of you, to Inside Olympia. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Important conversation we're about to have. I think just in terms of framing this conversation, I'd like to hear from both of you about how the work you're currently doing and how you are coming at the issue of AI. And I'd ask you to do that maybe in particular through the lens of thinking about policymakers who are sort of struggling with, what is this technology? Should we regulate it, not regulate it? How is it going to affect, the state, and what is the role of policy makers in particular? But I'll start with you, Professor Jago. What is your kind of organizing principle as you come about thinking about this technology?
Yeah, so ever since I started researching this, what's fascinated me is the human experience working with these kinds of technologies, which even over the course of my academic career so far has changed dramatically. And so when I think about it, I'm thinking about the psychological experience of working with these systems, how it makes us feel, what are they doing, and that mirrored with the actual sort of technological developments that are happening around us. Because ultimately there are two things that are both moving very quickly. One is these systems and their actual capabilities and what they can do in the world, and then similarly also our attitudes about AI, our perceptions of AI and what we think it can and cannot do, and what role it has in our life. So I approach that from a social psychological perspective, and in my research I run lots of surveys and experiments and field studies, basically looking at how people work with AI and think about it.
Okay, great. Rob, same question for you.
Well, and from our perspective, we work with states and local governments, and the question about AI is kind of a twofold one. One is, what do you want to use it for? And the other one is, what are the values you apply to it in that use? And the thing about governance and applying it in government is it has to match your community. But there's a world of technical capability, and with all technologies, if at their base, you can be very afraid of them and they can do a lot of harm. But the structure you put around them, how you train your staff and what they're capable of doing, the partnerships that you choose to have and choose not to have, and how you deploy them and what you pick as problems to start answering or start diving into, those are all expressions of the character of the government and how it chooses to work. And AI is but an implement and but a process. And it is, in a lot of ways, an undeniable one because so far we haven't seen anyone successfully resist an industrial revolution. But you can apply your values and your leadership to that progression. And the way we try to advise folks is make sure you know your priorities, make sure you have a skilling and pathing, make sure you execute projects effectively and show value. But AI is going to test you in a lot of ways, and know the ways that your community is going to express what's important to them and what they're not comfortable with, because hype usually comes with some success, but also some reverberations and even some hate. So that's part of that community conversation you have to have.
Maybe also just for table setting, and when I come back to you, we'll talk a little bit about specifically the Center for Digital Government and what it is and the work it's doing. But it strikes me that we are in this period of time when there's some disconnects, and one of the disconnects is that there seems to be a fairly, when you mentioned surveys, a fairly high level of distrust out there among the public about AI. At the same time, it's very much becoming part of our everyday lives. I mean, you almost can't go online or on your computer anymore and not have some AI chatbot trying to do something on your behalf. And then we're seeing a huge amount of disruption in certainly the tech industry, because they're shifting their investments to AI and away from paying for workers. There's a lot of layoffs happening. And so I'm just kind of interested to know about the surveys you're doing and how you're thinking about the swirling forces that we're all experiencing in this sort of hyper warp speed where everything seems to change, 6 months, 12 months, down the road.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because academia moves at a really glacial pace. And I was, in fact, just reviewing a paper where this conversation came up, and the data was collected in 2020, 2021, and it was about attitudes towards AI. And essentially the editor said, aren't we past this now? Aren't there completely different forces at play? You have to move as quickly as possible and try and get papers out and try and study kind of the more fundamental elements about how we're working with and thinking about these systems. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of great research looking at, for example, how does this specific new model from Anthropic or OpenAI perform on tasks X, Y, and Z? And I think that research is actually extremely valuable. It gives us lots of important benchmarking. But another thing that kind of motivates me is trying to think even deeper down, what is our relationship with technology, and does it echo something more fundamental about our relationships with other humans?
So you're teaching graduate business students, MBA candidates, right?
Yes.
How are you framing AI in that context, and how do you see your students who are heading off into the business world, probably for the most part, processing and thinking about it?
Yeah, well, I can say, at least in my classrooms, I've seen a similar negative sentiment that you see in commencement speeches from this year of
the boos.
Of boos that are reflecting kind of this broader degree of uncertainty.
Is AI am I going to even be needed? Is there going to be a job for me?
Am I going to have a job, right? And so that sort of distrust is definitely there, but I think that especially in a business school, which I'm located in, there's this sort of cautious optimism about, can we use this to positively impact the organizations around us, like the work you're doing, as well as use it to sort of impact our efficiency, improve our productivity in ways that maintain a positive workplace culture. And I think that tightrope might be a tough one to watch, but that's kind of what's on their mind, this both positive and negative side of the coin.
Yeah. So, Rob, Lloyd, let me help us understand your transition from being the Chief Technology Officer for the City of Seattle to leading the Center for Digital Government. Why did you make the transition? And then help us understand what the Center for Digital Government, and I guess within that, the Center for Public Sector AI, do, what their purpose is.
Sure. So let me answer your question forward and then go backwards and then the forwards again. So by way of my history, and when I was at the city of San Jose, we created our first AI action plan back in 2017, 2018. And we met this little nonprofit called OpenAI. We weren't even sure they were going to survive, but they were doing some really cool work. We also met with some people from Google that a couple of them later on had a role in the Transformers Generators paper. But we were very purposeful, saying we think that AI is starting to progress with natural language processing and machine learning, that it can help us in three major challenge areas that are really important to communities. One was with the mathematical models at the time, natural language processing. In San Jose, we spoke 304 languages. Every major language in the world was spoken in San Jose. And if you want people to have access to their government, to essential services, language and access should not be a barrier. Thesis number one. And AI can help overcome that. So we wanted to take a drive down that. Number two is around cybersecurity. We felt that some of the AI models that we could see, and it wasn't large language models back then, it was machine learning, natural language processing. But we wanted to take an effort there, and that's where we met, and it was GPT-1, no chat, no 0.0. But we figured out a mathematical model with armor blocks and OpenAI, where we were immune to spam and phishing and BEC attacks for the better part of 3.5 years. But the entire time we were afraid, saying when the bad guys figure this out, we're in a world of hurt. And then the other one was for transportation safety. Can we figure out ways that AI can help us figure out people anomalies, transportation, car anomalies, where we can make people safer in transportation? But the world was actually easier back then, where you were more focused. Now that everyone sees AI, and it's almost like everything to everyone, it gets more complicated. And then the hype phase comes up, and then the fear phase comes up right after that. So let me answer your question. The transition is twofold. One is I've been a CIO for 20 years, and there's part of you that says, yeah, I can do it again, or can I have a national impact? This is a very special inflection point. I was there for the internet, was there for mobile, was there for virtualization.
Cloud computing, probably.
Yeah. But you see some points in your career where you're like, how can I be of the most help in the biggest way at the right moments? And in the CIO community and the tech community, we know each other. A lot of us have these questions of, how is AI going to do the least harm and do the most good? How many of us know the most people and have examples and records where we can say we can create something really positive? In San Jose, my team created the GovAI Coalition, and that has over 1,000 partners, and they saw a bigger prize than I did when I originally contemplated what it could be. So they get all the credit on how big it's become. But the thesis there was, could we create the foundations from which we could make sure lots of people could build fast and build on top of each other? And the wonderful thing about government, and I think education too, is we like being first, but we like sharing just as much. And it's very not private sector in the sense that you would kind of hide your secrets, and it would be industrial espionage if you took someone else's knowledge. In public sector, we love it, and we build on each other, and that rising tide does lift all boats. And then the last part of what I'll say is AI is challenging us with that. We're getting into a phase of technology of values. And we have also a very cynical time and place right now, and how do we come here, and how do we get to a better place where we're talking with each other and answering the really hard questions and solving the really hard problems that face communities, with technologies being part of our toolbox rather than something we're just afraid of.
Just to be clear, is the work you're doing now kind of a consultancy role to state and local governments?
It's a good question. So the Center for Digital Government, and I have a peer, Brian, who's at the Center for Digital Education. Well, I'll have to introduce you. We do a research institute, so we do best practices work. There's convenings, so the councils, and we make sure the best people doing the best work, best thought leadership come together. There's awards programs to recognize and give those people that kind of credence. And also there's the sponsor work where the exemplar work is highlighted, and that's supported by sponsors. It is that platform to highlight best thoughts, best work, and convene and events and recognition. And that's been around Center for Digital Governments now in its 25th year.
Okay. I would like to maybe have you give us a couple of examples
Sure.
in a few minutes of sort of successes and interesting, projects that you're seeing. Arthur, let's, again, I want to think about this conversation in terms of especially what policymakers might be able to be thinking about, let's say you're a state legislator, and this year there was legislation passed around companion chatbots, which are in the news. It's sort of a rip from the headlines issue, concern about youth, teens who are online and start out using ChatGPT for homework help, and suddenly are developing a relationship, and then there are allegations and lawsuits that chatbots have led youth to suicide. So that's been an urgent issue for legislators. But there's also been a lot of talk and legislation here and elsewhere around concerns around algorithmic discrimination, for instance. If AI is being used to screen resumes or vet people for housing or for healthcare or insurance or education, any number of arenas, might there be sort of discrimination built into those models because they're trained on existing information that might also be biased? And then how do you guard against that? So how would you suggest that policymakers think about where to prioritize? Because there's just so much. And I gave you two examples. There's a litany of examples of sort of buckets or baskets that you could be regulating or legislating around.
I think that those are two just fantastic examples because they're two ends of this continuum of our interaction with these kinds of technologies, right? As outlined in the new Washington state regulations about AI, something like an AI companion is a technology that everyone is thinking about, knowing that it's an AI and sort of saying, am I going to self-disclose this? What kinds of bond am I going to perform with this technology? It's very front of mind. Whereas a topic like algorithmic discrimination is often happening behind the scenes. It's not nearly as in front of people despite it impacting consequential life outcomes. And so from this particular standpoint, as a psychologist, I'm always thinking about harm similarly of, are these technologies doing harm or doing good, like the trade-off that you were discussing earlier. And the intriguing thing about that kind of question is that AI is proliferating at such a rapid pace that we not only need to look at, okay, does this specific technology cause good, cause harm in this particular context, but where might it be spreading, right? And a lot of this research on algorithmic discrimination is just totally fascinating to me because a lot of it is in instances that you aren't really even thinking about that you're interacting with an algorithm, right? I'm sure that if you go to your favorite streaming service and it says, oh, you might like these TV shows or these movies, a lot of people aren't thinking about, oh, there's an algorithm that's using data from me and from the millions of other users of this platform to give me this recommendation. Thank you, AI, for this, new rom-com that I'm now going to check out, right? The reality is people say, great, this looks interesting, I'm going to click it, and then they click it, right?
And they feed the algorithm.
And then they keep feeding the algorithm, right? And so a lot of the very interesting cases of algorithmic discrimination were uncovered by journalists and policymakers, basically saying, wait, how are companies using data in this way? For example, cases of algorithmic collusion, of using algorithms to set rent, and then everyone realizes that lots of different rental companies are using the exact same algorithm, and it's basically negotiating against itself, right? These are the kinds of cases that journalists and people, whistleblowers, really need to sort of shed the public light on because they're not necessarily as front of mind as something like a chatbot that I see, my kid interacting with for longer than I want them to.
So just to follow up, how do you think policymakers should be sort of organizing their thinking, because they could be focused on the kind of low-hanging, threats. They could be thinking about transparency. They could be thinking about trying to regulate the black box that is AI, so on and so forth. I mean, it keeps going, and it's changing so quickly. Where would you even start?
Where do you start? Well, if you're trying to audit an algorithm for bias or discrimination, for example, you can look at input, process, and output. And there's a lot of really interesting research looking at these areas. And I think that some basic familiarity with how these kinds of systems work is first and foremost necessary. And I think that to really answer your question, you kind of need to do some work on both sides of the coin. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I even know what this is going to look like in 10 or 15 years. Look at video generation software today. If you showed people the viral video of Brad Pitt fighting Tom Cruise that was AI generated and said this was AI generated 4 years ago, a lot of people probably wouldn't even believe you. So on one hand, I think it is important to pay attention to the popular technologies that are happening right now. Look for discrimination, look for harm, look for the kinds of things that you don't want to see, but it kind of evokes this more fundamental question question about how are we thinking about technology and its role in business and its role in society from a more fundamental perspective. And I think that's a much tougher question to answer compared to saying, well, this particular thing, good, bad, what should we be doing about it?
What do you think about this, Rob?
Well, I think this is, there's a couple answers to your question. One is that it is going to evolve, and that there has to be some clear liability terms that evolve both legally and mathematically. The science, the math still has to come to bear here, and it's going to have to work its way through legislation and through court and case law. But there's a couple areas where we need more clarity. One is when you're trying to manipulate people and behavior, there isn't enough clarity there. And when your intent is to manipulate a person's behavior or a group's behavior, there's very little there right now, but we have to be very careful. We've seen models where we can convince people to vote in a certain pattern very effectively. And we had people approach us and say, hey, we have some great tools. And we said, that's part of our prohibited group. And like, but don't you want your levies to pass? Don't you want your votes to go in a certain direction? Don't you want your council members to get reelected? It's like, we do, but not that way. On the other side of certain issues, they might not have those rules. So communities, nations are going to have to work their way through that. Other things is, if you're a gamer or if you're a seller, you might think someone's your friend, and they might not even exist. But those of us who have gamed, you might stay on a little longer if your crew is like, hey, one more mission. And if that's not even a person, you could be buying things, you could be staying on, and you could be spending and engaging socially. And you see in some nations where they're very isolated, and it's a very unhealthy phenomenon. So you see a psychological impact. And then beyond that, there's some very strict liability on when you're making contractual or human decisions about people's livelihoods, adverse impact, contractual outcomes. And then I'll go all the way to critical infrastructure. That we have to be very, very careful with. If it's electrical, if it's water, the Department of Homeland Security actually brought together leaders across the country to say, how do we protect this and create some rules together before some legislators say nothing's been done and we'll do it ourselves. And if you've ever seen those federal testimony things, it's kind of funny because there's not a lot of understanding there. But how do the best experts engage in good faith to say what are the best rules? We don't see enough of those forums. So I think, just to kind of reiterate, if it's there to manipulate people, you have to say that outright, and there needs to be more progress on mathematical models and liability rules, bar none. And then when organizations are acting in a specific manner, we have to have more clarity, and they have to be upfront about what they're doing and where their rules are and are not. And then we have some national and utility and other interests where we're going to have to say, best experts, we have to come up and say, here are the rules for what we need to protect.
Given those examples of the potential that there's already tools out there that can manipulate elections, for instance, we also sort of, the conversation sometimes toggles between, doomsdayers, AI doomsdayers, and those who are sort of evangelists for the technology. And then there's a bunch of people in the middle who say it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. Just before we go to break, let me hear from each of you. Where do you fall on that continuum? And I'll start with you, Arthur. Are you an evangelist for this? Are you a doomsdayer? Somewhere in between.
So when you learn statistics, you very quickly learn about the idea of a confidence interval, which is if I say, this is my prediction of how warm it will be in 3 days, right? You can have a very small confidence interval of saying it will be within, 2 degrees of this estimate, or a very wide one. What I tell my students is that I have a very wide confidence interval in terms of any prediction about the future of AI. I think that there's a lot of wonderful argumentation on the upside and its ability to bring out some sort of human utopia in the very far future. That said, there's an obvious discourse about the negative sides here. So I think that if I had to pick a side right now, I would maintain neutrality with an understanding that there is a very bright future and also the possibility of a very dark future.
And I'm an experimental humanist in this one. And to kind of go to a kind of, I'll be a little philosophical here, kind of a Dewey philosopher is democracy is as much an experimental system as a political system. We will express our values and how we do government in how we adopt AI. And we will have some amazing failures, and we will have some amazing successes, as with everything else we've done. And how we do this is choice. And we have the ability to choose great leaders and choose great problem sets and solve amazing problems. And we need to be very careful that we don't create great harms. But we also have a history where we have. And we have an interest in the Center for Digital Government to keep those harms very few and very small, because our communities need trust. We have the lowest amount of trust in AI of any developed country, according to the Ipsos poll. We also have the lowest trust in government and our effectiveness that we've had ever in those poll histories. So we need to really be effective in our governance. And that's why we believe and work so hard in the work that we do, because AI is going to do amazing things. And we're also going to create great harms. Both things can be true. And I'll give you 2 data points. Everyone has some great fears about AI. And if you look at those surveys, 80+% of people are using AI. 2 things can be true at the same time.
On the sort of negative externality side, do you think that those bad outcomes are ones we can survive, or does AI, these frontier models, there's a lot of concern about the potential for them to be misused to create, mass casualty events and nuclear and biological weaponry. Can we recover from the bad decisions and outcomes?
In our current regulatory model, that's a real and serious question. And currently, the way it's structured, you have a lot of serious and real doubts. So how can we come in and say, from private sector and public sector and in a regulatory model, how do the smartest people regulate this in the best way that at least the extreme cases are modeled out? But you have a lot of people who say, if we don't, they will. There's a fair argument there.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break. When we return, we will continue our conversation on the role and impacts of AI in society and governments, back right after this.
Addiction, resulting anxiety, depression, self-harm, exploitation, suicidality, suicide, accidental deaths, right? All of these pieces, it's predation, it's they're designing these things in a way that they know. Maybe they didn't know before they started. They know now, and they're still doing it, and children are suffering. We thought that we had seen the worst that these companies could do by design, and we hadn't.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again are Rob Lloyd of the Center for Digital Government and the Center for Public Sector AI, and Arthur Jago, an Associate Professor of Management at the University of Washington Tacoma. I'm really interested, Rob, in use cases where local and state governments are finding AI to be useful and productive. We just came off of sort of the worst case
doom
scenario,
cases,
the doom
yeah.
cases. But clearly, there is a lot of exploration and a lot of effort to try to leverage AI to deliver government services more efficiently. As you noted, this effort to reach more people in more languages, analyze and improve traffic safety, speed up perhaps the delivery of services to individuals. So can you think of a couple of examples, or when you were thinking of, when you were mentioning the awards that are being issued, could you give us, kind of put some meat on the bones here and give us some ideas of how, especially the public sector, is using AI right now?
Yeah, and let me give you a range. And we have the AI 50 awards that are going to come out here shortly, so I'll try not to steal their thunder. But on the extreme case, cybersecurity is an area in the last 8, almost 9 months that has taken a real dire and stark tone. You had OpenClaw, you had Mythos more recently, and what that means is it was one thing when you had a fragmented cybersecurity environment and you couldn't quite see everything, and certain departments were doing their thing, and identity and devices were out there, and it was kind of a dim view of a spread out environment. It changes when you have now agents. that are acting on information, have access, and want access to your crown jewel information on which they can do and create more information, and they can read and share and answer. And maybe they do a little too much or a lot too much and do wrong things. And then another agent that actually is acting on your behalf and running things. And when they have permission to do that and they're moving at machine scale, imagine it running a plant or rendering a service, and it issues refunds or shuts down your store online, or shuts down a service or a plant. That is machine scale and speed.
And we're getting to this point now where these models are capable of doing real harm.
Yes, but
on the cybersecurity front.
Yeah, but here's where it turns potentially good, is these tools are also showing in the code, they're able to deduce where there's gaps in where the code has security flaws, and helping fill those at potential speed and scale that software houses and teams haven't been able to in the past. And we're starting to see like Mozilla and others say, hey, we're going to use these tools to actually augment on the positive side, on the Jedi side of the Force. And that's a good thing, and we're starting to see more tools. Darwin's been able to be across the country and say we can actually watch for AI governance and use, and actually inform your utilization and your visibility to say they match your values. I'll give you 3 areas where we see a trend on the leading AI utilization organizations, states, counties, cities. And that's where they say, we don't want to replace jobs, though there will be job impacts, no doubt, from AI. We have plenty of space where we're going to focus on 3 things first. One is where our employees are overwhelmed. Number 2 is where we want to be a lot smarter. And number 3 is where we want to be responsive in ways that we can't right now. And so where we're seeing, to your question, real great advances with AI is like in CRM, where there's virtual agents. You have some communities that have bots that when you ask a question in any language, it answers the question right away rather than you having to wait for a response. And it'll direct you to the service, direct you to the page, and say, would you like to start that process? Would you like to start that ticket? And it'll get you right into exactly the right place, get you the right number, trash pickup, your dates for pickup. It'll get you to a homeless response service, get you right away to those types of things. Permitting is another one, and that's really important to a lot of cities for 2 reasons. One is they try to evolve their economies still after COVID, on the business side plus the housing side, because housing is attached to homelessness, affordability, and even educational outcomes for children. And so many communities are still trying to do that. So you have Bellevue with GovStream, you have Scottsdale, you have San Jose, you have Louisville, you have Boston, showing stark increases in how fast and how responsive, and decreasing error rates by using AI to help people through those processes. Public safety, and how you're able to say, response can be improved by making sure that we can go through our cases when people call 911, what's non-emergency, what's emergency, and then when an operator's on, they're responding in the right way. And the AI will say, hey, you did that to the T, or we're going to train you a little bit more because you missed part of the queue. And even Seattle has this one with Corti, in the back of the emergency response, did you miss something, or did you go through the entire protocol?
Would that be for the paramedics?
Yep, you got it. So going through the exact protocol to make sure you have maximum positive outcomes for health. So you can go through all these things where AI is an assistive piece, but you can make that smarter decision. You can be more responsive, and it takes the pressure off of people. But the thing that I'll conclude with is, and this is a really good example from what we heard from Marty Lesh. He had a session with some legislators over at a construction area, and there's a 3D printer and AI. And they were talking with them and saying, aren't you afraid this is going to take your job? And the construction people were like, yeah, but I have 2 bad knees and a bad back, and if you give me a nail gun versus a hammer, I'm good with that. But you have to show me I have a path. And I understand there's going to be some impacts, just be honest with me, but give me a path. And that's part of the conversation we have to have, is what is that path? You can't leave people behind.
It's a good transition to talk about your research, Arthur, around the relationship between, especially employees and AI. And you weren't necessarily looking at job displacement, but you were looking at what happens if AI starts to manage the worker rather than a human. And I'm really interested in sort of what your maybe thesis was going in, what you looked at, and then sort of what the findings were. And I hope I captured the essence of that accurately.
It's actually a good transition because one of the kind of the fundamental questions here is, well, to what degree is a human in the loop, right? And that really actually does shape a lot of people's assessments about these kinds of situations. Like, well, I used a chatbot to figure out when my trash is going to get picked up, and can I change that, or can I do this one request? And the synthesis of human and AI decision making is really important to people's experiences with these kinds of situations, because on average, when you look at the data, people are completely fine using these kinds of machines to engage in these types of tasks. And I love these examples of being able to improve government, improve society using these kinds of systems at scale. That said, there are many situations, some that I've identified in my research, others that other psychologists have looked at, where all of a sudden implementing AI produces a lot of negative affect and some pretty negative reactions. Basically, our entire understanding of human organization has this assumption that, well, there's another person making a decision about me, or there's another person helping me, and that's what's built our academic understanding of this. And we've seen this kind of wildfire of all of a sudden with AI and now AI agents, this capacity, well, a human is now doing this, right? I think that one of the critical moderators here is going to be, am I interacting entirely with an agent, or am I interacting with an agent and a person? Because in the research you're summarizing here, people have a very strong negative reaction to just being given an AI agent alone and saying, here you go. For example, if you have an AI management system, which lots of organizations, think rideshare companies, actually operate at scale, people really dislike that. And people say, you're not paying enough attention to me. I'm more special than this, right? But as soon as you include humans in the loop, people feel way more comfortable with these kinds of systems, knowing that they're going to have this kind of off-ramp of if the interaction doesn't go the way that they want to. And so that's one of the things we're kind of exploring. Eric Brynjolfsson is an economist who is now at Stanford. He wrote a wonderful book called The Second Machine Age. He really studies AI and inequality, and he's been actually a proponent of saying, I dislike the term artificial intelligence, because the way we should be thinking about it now is augmented intelligence. When you're thinking about a large language model, there is a person who is prompting and iteratively working with this kind of machine. So we can't be thinking about just the machine or just the person in isolation. Right now, at least, there's a lot of synthesis.
What is the, if you're talking about algorithmic management, your finding was that using machines to perform social roles, and I imagine a social role is a role that we typically associate with a human, diminishes the status of the worker. Can you help explain that to us?
Yeah, so we ran a bunch of experiments, a bunch of surveys in a variety of different settings, and a really good experiment in the social sciences is often very simple. And so we did things like ask people about hypothetical jobs where we have our manager, you know, Rob, or we have our AI manager. What do you think about this job? Would you apply to it? What do you think would happen here? Similarly, we asked people about both real and imagined changes that could be happening in their current organization. And what we found in that particular paper was as soon as you introduce AI into a hierarchy above you, that becomes really bad. People like AI and hierarchies next to you. People like subordinate AIs that are helping me get my job done. But the main conclusion that we tried to draw from that research was basically you need to be very, very sensitive in terms of how you are implementing AI in organizations, because it can have a really, really transformational impact on how people think about where's my position vis-a-vis everyone else and what's my position at this company.
So maybe an AI assistant, yes. An AI manager, no.
Yes.
At least at this.
Actually,
at least right now.
Yeah. I'll reinforce your point. A very clear pattern we see in virtual agents where people interact with a bot is when it works, people often are happier than had they worked with a person. When it doesn't work, they're angrier than had they worked with a person. there is no middle. And the demand for an off-ramp, if the bot doesn't work, is real, because the anger accelerates at an exceptional rate if it fails and there's no off-ramp, because people feel trapped by the technology in an extreme way. And there was a couple experiments with virtual agents in San Jose that when I was there we did, and they're like, wow, you can't get any lower than 0 on satisfaction. And so even though it wasn't that wrong, they got really angry really fast that it wasn't quite right, and they had no out. So I think that's part of the experience.
So it's not just a human in the loop, but a path to a human.
Well, and the other thing is, and one of the language you hear is also human in the lead, which it's kind of weird language, but it is true also that we have to retrain models to drift on occasion, and as policy changes, the human also has to always make sure that it stays true. Part of the process we have in tech is also that the tools and the partners we pick have that observability, that things are still performing correctly, and that the experience stays positive, and along the way that there's some kind of a proportion that we audit to say, is the AI still performing? Because the correct process on this one that we've identified is that someone owns the output of AI performance and you're responsible for a sampling. So someone can always say, no, we have someone check that it's still performing, and if you're giving us feedback that it's not, someone owns that. Because you can never fire the AI, but someone has to own it ultimately.
I want to ask you about something that seems sort of so simple and obvious, and yet it seems like governments are failing at this every day, and that is disclosure. So Nate Sanford has done some really interesting reporting for KNKX and Cascade PBS based on public records requests of Washington State, Western Washington cities, asking how are you using AI and ChatGPT in particular. And it turns out it's in widespread use. City-level staff are using it to help draft letters and responses, and it's like clearly already ingrained in public agencies.
We had a survey. 76% of government employees, the Center for Digital Government did a survey about a year and a half ago. 76% said they use it daily.
There you go. And yet, the reporting found that none of the records reviewed included disclosures that AI was used in their production. And this included policy documents, talking points, speeches, press releases, responses to audit recommendations, applications for grants, responses to constituent emails. And they weren't letting people know. You know, what are the implications of that if we're already in this kind of negative trust environment? And then cities, which are supposed to be being very careful, or public agencies especially careful about this, aren't disclosing. It seems like maybe they've shot themselves in the foot before we've even gotten out of the gates, to really mix metaphors.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer first. As CTO of Seattle, one of the things we wanted to do is channel people through a couple tools first. Said use these because people found their own right off the bat. As soon as ChatGPT came out, people were using it. Absolutely 100% sure. I wasn't in Seattle at that time, but we knew it. As soon as something goes popular, people are consumers. That's human nature. So can you give people a good outlet? It has never worked, my experience as a CIO for 20 years, to tell people don't do something at all.
You can't have access, don't touch it.
Yeah, and you can try, but I've never actually seen it work. And so cities usually are the first laboratory. They're the fastest. Is if you give people a golden bridge, use this, it works well. You can capture 70-80% of that utilization, and then you have the logs. You have the patterns. You can build up a better practice. You can support people in getting even better if you come into the right path. And then you can capture the stragglers a different way. But Seattle had that problem, and part of that guidance we gave with the Seattle AI plan was, here's how we're going to corral it and be more transparent about it, and use it for the good things, and be honest where someone has gone off the path, and we have to be able to do the corrective action.
Do you agree that government entities do need to disclose to their constituencies and to the public when they're using AI,
Yeah.
and when product is when some material product has been created
Yeah.
in part or
It's the material
whole.
part. So if I'm doing a spell check, I'd say no.
Yeah.
If I'm saying it's drafting and it's substantially created, and that's the line is like if it's materially created something, you have to disclose it. San Jose, when I was there, we created the same policy. If it's materially or substantially created something, you need to disclose it.
Arthur, you pointed us to this American Psychological Association paper on how AI, chatbots, and digital companions are reshaping emotional connection. There is an emotional, and we've been talking about this, but I just want to kind of feed that in as you're thinking about the response to this idea of what the expectation of the constituent, the public, is.
Yeah, I think there's actually some interesting research on actor-observer effects of how people think about working with AI. And I think it relates very directly to this expectation of disclosure. If you have a consulting firm that comes in and gives you a presentation that you paid a lot for, and you learn that they used entirely AI to make it, the average person's going to be irritated at that, right?
Yeah, we got ripped off.
We got ripped off.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, there's a potential actor-observer effect that there is some evidence for that, well, that consulting firm might have spent a lot of time iterating and working with AI. In our own research, we actually study what we call authorship perception and authorship attributions of people working with these kinds of systems. And it turns out that if you're, working with ChatGPT to develop a screenplay or a creative work product, people actually recognize in their own work, the AI might have ultimately written this, but I was guiding it and I was editing it and I was prompting it to do exactly what I wanted to get this specific output at this specific vision that I was looking for. And so they're saying, consequently, yeah, I do feel comfortable claiming ownership of this work because I think I've put a lot of effort in and it's reflecting what I want to see. And so I think there might be a potential mismatch between producers, people engaging in work using these kinds of systems, and then constituents or audiences who are then seeing those systems and their expectations about A, are you using AI, and B, tell me exactly how you're using it and why that's important.
But I would make a big distinction between the screenwriter who uses AI to help them as maybe like a research assistant or to help them think about even how to improve the plot line, let's say, versus allowing the AI to write the screenplay based on their prompts. To me, those are, I don't want to see the movie that AI wrote. I don't mind seeing the movie that the screenwriter used AI to make a better movie or to write a better screenplay.
Well, and there's also small models and specialized models where you can train it just on your work. And so you can, in theory, claim this is more me than anything.
But this is the slippery slope where I think it's part of why we have the trust quotient issue, is that the public, it seems like it very quickly.
You will hear Deloitte and Accenture, I'm sure, say, this is our specialized model built on our consultancies and our consultant work, and it's no one else's. And so I think then you could say, okay, I get you, that's just your products. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about the threshold seems a bit nicer when you say this is our specialized tool and product. I would be more forgiving for that.
Where this is actually one of my main research directions going forward, so I'm glad we're talking about this. When you look at kind of audience and people's perceptions of AI, there's kind of what I call a blood in the water effect of there's this very strong tendency to look at it as this sort of binary thing of did you use AI or did you not? And in many domains, including creative consumption domains, there's this real aversion compared to something like predicting if a hurricane is going to hit your coast or not. There, people are very, very much okay with AI. And so one thing we're working on is, well, why is this happening? And is there anything that producers can do to sort of restore trust in these systems or the authenticity of something that we otherwise would expect coming from another person?
So let's use your students as another example, though. What if you've got an entrepreneurial student who wants to start their own business? They come up with a pitch deck, and somehow they get some meetings with some venture capitalists to pitch them on funding this idea. What are your thoughts about sort of the ethical lines around how much AI helped them? I'm not saying design the pitch deck, but help them come up with the idea for the business, maybe wrote the pitch deck, which is the kind of thing that you tear your hair out and iterate on dozens of times before you would ever show it to anybody, right? How would you help your students navigate how they're going to use AI as a tool without cheating?
I have two quick responses.
Yeah, you first. I'm going to go.
Okay, yeah. One response is we talk a lot about ethics in an MBA education, and ultimately a lot of it comes down to personal values, and that's something I definitely encourage my students to sort of self-explore. I don't tell them how much or how little to use in this kind of case, but I would encourage them to reflect and apply a sort of decision process to try and figure that out for themselves. Second, very quickly, I'm sure that many small businesses and businesses were started with us bouncing around ideas in a garage right before I go and do my pitch deck.
Or looking at other pitch decks.
Or looking at other pitch decks, right? And so it's kind of a more fundamental question about what is theft, what is use, right? And I think that AI, as an example, is a really wonderful brainstorming partner. And that's actually one of the ways that I encourage my students to use it. For example, if you want to start a business, tell me 10 reasons why it's not going to work, right? This is actually a tactic taught in many business schools that used to be run with humans, and now we can run it very cheaply and at scale with these kinds of automated systems.
And let me give you kind of a different take. And there was a time when 5% of the population could read or write, and then you had the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press. AI is effectively the printing press of product creation. Today, more and more people are able to, in a paragraph narrative format, say, create this for me. And Claude Code or others can instantly take your narrative and create a database, a web page, all the background frameworks, release, a store for you, everything you need to actually have a company, a product and a company. Venture capital companies used to say, don't talk to me, even your pitch deck, until you have a product. And you can take it out there and show me a couple people have used it and hammered at it. A16Z would say, until you have a product, you're not really real, unless you're maybe the really exceptional one or two people out there a year. But this printing press moment of idea to thing is what AI has inverted, because the cost of intelligence for the first time has gone down. Every other technology before this has made a person more valuable, has multiplied the intelligence of a person, the capabilities of a person. This is the first one that displaces a person. And you can have an idea and something can do it for you. And so that's valuable in its own right, because it can kind of have a multiplier effect in that way. So that can be good. But I do believe it gets to two other concepts where we might go. One is the math and the tokenization. You can see to some degree who deserves credit for what was created. And there is a deserving conversation there of, if we create music based on other people's music and that was in that model, should someone have rights to that? And most of us would argue to some degree, yes, if it hits a threshold at least. Where that threshold is, don't know, but that should be there. And another one is truth. More and more we can create stuff that looks so real, we're losing track of what is true. And somewhere along the line, we're going to have a renewal with a bond of truth to say, how do we put a ribbon of encryption in that says, or these are the truth, bastions of truth in government, so we can go back and say, was that real or not? Because at some point, we won't know anymore.
And then we won't believe anything is real.
You got it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are basically out of time. So Arthur, I'm going to give you the last word here. And I've got, just very briefly, though, this idea of, or do we run the risk of outsourcing too much of this to AI, and then we forget how to think and we forget how to relate to humans because we're just engaging with the chatbot?
Yeah, I was just talking with my MBA class actually about a wonderful study out of MIT's Media Lab called Your Brain on ChatGPT. And there are a lot of sort of hilarious, to me at least, findings there. One of them being that if you're using an LLM to write text, you actually can't really remember anything that you've submitted compared to using a search engine or just yourself. I think that this worries a lot of psychologists, this idea of outsourcing cognition, and especially just assuming that an AI is right, or that an AI is fair, or that an AI is going to have the best solution to a problem that a government or a society is facing.
Because what some people will say is it's just extruding text.
And as we were talking about earlier, it's often trying to keep you on a platform or say things that'll make you feel good and like it, so you keep maintaining your subscription.
Okay. So it's here. It's probably here to stay. There might be some upsides, but it sounds like tread carefully as well as kind of the takeaways. We are out of time. So Arthur Jago, Rob Lloyd, thanks for coming in. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you very much.
I think we'll probably have to have 2.0 version of this soon. But,
One more year,
We'll have
right?
you. Yeah, exactly. We'll have you back. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.